Our greetings, friends, and welcome. Another episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us as we wrap up what's been, dare I say, an historic week, going back a week ago where we had the announcement of Canada's trade agreement with China into this week, where, of course, the Prime Minister was in Davos for the World Economic Forum, and all kinds of new questions about our relationship with the United States. Now, the week comes to an end with the U.S. President Donald Trump coming off the heels of what happened at Davos, announcing that Canada has been disinvited from this new Board of Peace that Donald Trump is establishing. Now, it's unclear what this Board of Peace is supposed to be, whether it's about reconstructing Gaza specifically, or whether it's meant to be some kind of new Trump version of the United Nations. Regardless, I think this was going to be an awkward and uncomfortable decision potentially for Mark Carney, with a price tag of $1 billion to join this Board of Peace. And for now, it seems a lot of autocratic regimes, like, for example, Russia, sitting on this Board of Peace. So Donald Trump uninviting Mark Carney kind of takes that decision out of the Prime Minister's hands. But it does speak to where things are at in a week where this trade agreement with China has irked the Americans. Of course, even though Donald Trump has been pursuing his own trade agreement with China. But of course, the speech in Davos. Now, Mark Carney's got a lot of reaction to this speech, and maybe that's why it's made such headlines here at home, because it's made headlines elsewhere. It's almost like the reaction to the speech has been bigger maybe than the speech itself. But Mark Carney did talk about in that speech, and he didn't mention the U.S. or Donald Trump by name, or really for that matter, any other countries. But essentially, it does stem from how things have changed with the United States. So remember, going into this World Economic Forum, Donald Trump's threats about Greenland, threats about new tariffs on European countries, that was casting a large shadow. So it was in that shadow that Mark Carney spoke earlier this week in Davos, where he talked about the old rules-based international order basically being gone. The middle powers, such as Canada, need to build new alliances to navigate all of this. And again, he didn't mention some of these other middle powers by name, but clearly, I mean, that is the snapshot of where things are at. You know, the rhetoric is there, the moment is there. What does the follow-through actually look like? Here's a little bit of what the Prime Minister had to say in this speech this week in Davos.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with a greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades, For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
And so, as mentioned, this speech did get a lot of international reaction, a lot of international headlines. Here's one example just of how it was playing this week in Davos. California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, who was in Davos, almost just there to kind of irritate Donald Trump, it seems, but he was speaking at his own event and went out of his way to remark about the impact that Carney's speech had.
So am I surprised by what Carney did? Quite the contrary. I thought it was, I had more leaders from the United States quietly, not publicly, not us standing up publicly, the transcript of that speech saying, wow. They were, got in Trump's head yesterday, he brought it up. You know everything about Trump because it's what's not in the teleprompter. It tells you everything you need to know about where Trump's head is on things. It was incredibly effective. The markets were more effective. Markets. It's not Mother Nature. Thought of most powerful force on earth with Mother Nature, but it's the markets, particularly the Trump administration. Combine that with the comments of Macron, combine that with the EU commissioner, but the clarity that came from Prime Minister of Canada. But the fact that he went to China, came back with a deal, started introducing low-cost, high-quality electric vehicles, not made in Michigan, Detroit, but overseas into Canada. It says everything you know about the recklessness of America's foreign policy. Everything you need to know. You know it intimately, but it's a remarkable thing to break down 80-plus years of alliances. It takes decades and decades to build trust in organizations, the architecture of that. It takes weeks, tweets, hours, minutes sometimes to destroy it.
Okay, but as mentioned, it doesn't appear as though the speech went over well with the Americans or with Donald Trump in particular. Maybe not just the content of the speech, but maybe just the fact that, Mark Carney was kind of stealing the show in Davos when Donald Trump really looked to make a big splash. So he had a bit of a warning of sorts for Canada. This is what the American president said.
For national and international security and to keep our very energetic and dangerous potential enemies at bay, is this land on which we're going to build the greatest golden dome ever built. We're building a golden dome that's going to, just by its very nature, going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Now, it's interesting how things have kind of reset coming out of this summit. I mean, Donald Trump went in talking about he was determined to take over Greenland one way or another, and again, threatening tariffs against European countries who weren't prepared to go along with this. But now coming out of the World Economic Forum, Trump has backed down. He announced that those tariffs were on hold, that there was some potential for some kind of a deal around Greenland, which would essentially give the U.S. what it basically has access to now, or what it could have got by just working with its allies. The idea of some more specific sovereignty over where U.S. bases are, the ability to set up radar or other capabilities, and maybe some involvement in potential future mineral development in Greenland. What was the point of these threats? What was the point of driving such a wedge between the U.S. and its NATO allies? And for that matter, really undermining the NATO alliance itself. And other comments Donald Trump made this week about NATO not being there for the U.S. even though, of course, NATO invoked Article 5 when the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. NATO countries, Canada, Denmark, and others, of course, lost many lives, contributed a lot of blood in defense of the United States following 9/11, of course, in the conflict in Afghanistan. So, yes, Donald Trump really went out of his way, I think, to alienate allies and to almost embarrass himself in the United States on the international stage, and all for what? So it was really puzzling. But yes, it's pretty clear that Mark Carney's words were noticed and maybe not appreciated by the Americans. So that led, of course, to the disinvitation that we mentioned at the outset. Mark Carney is no longer welcome on Donald Trump's new Board of Peace, which, again, maybe the Prime Minister is not going to be too sad about. But it does raise the question of, well, where do things stand now between Canada and the U.S.? I think Mark Carney's point about, look, we just have to deal with the U.S. as it is, try to retain as much trade as we can, look for other trading partners, that makes sense. But of course, we still need to deal with the U.S. There is still the CUSMA renegotiation happening this year. So what does it mean for that? So a lot of questions moving forward. And of course, there is the question that, you know, the speech was great, but what does it mean in practice? What does this new Carney doctrine look like? You know, where is the urgency when it comes to building up Canada's self-sufficiency or finding these new trading partners? Really trying to spur all of this on. I think that's certainly what the Conservatives are going to harp on once Parliament resumes next week. Now, I'll play a little bit of this as well. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre responding to Mark Carney's speech. And what's interesting here is that Pierre Poilievre does praise the speech, does say that they're prepared to work with the government in advancing some of these ideas, but says behind the rhetoric, there needs to be some action.
Prime Minister Carney's well-crafted and eloquently delivered speech at Davos has been widely noted, and I want to start by offering my own praise. The Prime Minister is right to restate what many have said for years. Canada must become more self-reliant, less dependent, and work with like-minded countries to advance our interests. And Conservatives are, as always, willing to work with him to turn these words into results. What stood out most to me was when he pointed out, quote, the gaps between rhetoric and reality. That's especially true here at home. If liberal words and good intentions were tradable commodities, Canada would already be the richest nation on earth. Unfortunately, after a decade of promises and grand speeches, liberals have made our economy costly and dependent, more so than ever. After nearly a year as Prime Minister, Mark Carney has made things only worse. The deficit has doubled, food inflation is double that in the States, housing costs have also doubled, the worst in the G7, and no pipelines are approved, anti-development laws removed. The military has a massive recruiting and equipment shortfall. There's still no free trade between provinces, no crime laws have been passed, and the Prime Minister's signature promise of negotiating a win with the U.S. is unfulfilled. Indeed, U.S. tariffs have more than doubled on Canada, while Mr. Carney's promised counter tariffs have vanished along with his elbows.
Okay, so that was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and his reaction to the speech. Now, of course, he faces a big week next week, not just with Parliament resuming, but of course the Conservative Convention and his own leadership review. And we'll see what happens there. Now, as for Mark Carney, he returned to Canada late in the week and actually spoke Thursday in Quebec City, where a Liberal cabinet retreat was happening. And he gave another speech, was billed as kind of an address to Canadians, which really, honestly, almost sounded more like an election stump speech or a kickoff to an election campaign. Look, I have no idea whether the Liberals are planning for or want to try to trigger an election this year. I mean, certainly now with everything going on with Donald Trump and his threats, it kind of feels like we're back to that same atmosphere that we were in when the election occurred last year. All the 51st state and elbows up and all of that kind of feels like we're back at this point. So unclear what Mark Carney's speech in Quebec City was supposed to be about. But it did give him an opportunity to respond to Donald Trump's comments about Canada. Here's what the Prime Minister said in response to that.
Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. Nous, nous sommes maîtres chez nous. C'est notre pays. C'est notre avenir. Le choix nous appartient. We choose to build a bright future, worthy of the ground on which we stand. We choose Canada.
Okay, so that was the Prime Minister speaking this week in Quebec City, wrapping up what's been a fascinating, a significant, maybe even a historic week. And a lot of questions now moving forward about Canada's relationship with the United States, our relationship with the rest of the world, what it all means domestically, politically. So joining us for some further thoughts on all of these big questions, very pleased to welcome back to the program Andrew Coyne. He's a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and you can read his latest on all of this at theglobeandmail.com. He's also author of the book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, released last year. Andrew, great to have you back with us here. Welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
You know, it's funny. I mean, in recent years, it feels like, one moment we're living through history, then the next bit of craziness happens, and we've kind of forgotten all about that other thing. So maybe that'll happen here, but I don't know. I mean, was this a historic week? Was this a week that is going to resonate for a long time to come, do you think?
I suspect so. Only history will tell us, but I think this was the week that Europe in particular was done with Trump. That when he had pushed things to such an insane level over Greenland, such that people were rushing troops to Greenland as tripwires. Legislation was being prepared in the U.S. Senate to forbid it. U.S. military brass were debating whether they should disobey a clearly illegal order. I mean, when things get that insane, I think this was the end. We shall see, but I think this marks the end of the attempts by world leaders, European leaders in particular, to try to appease Trump, propitiate him, mollify him, whatever word you want to use. The softly approach, I think, is now over. And you saw that in some of the extraordinary scenes at Davos, where, the president of France refused to meet with them after Trump leaked one of their private texts. Trump, set up this ridiculous global peace council. Supposedly all the world leaders were going to join it. Nobody did of any consequence. It's a rogues gallery of minor potentates that actually showed up for the event. So something was broken there. And even though they averted the absolute calamity of a military showdown over Greenland, or even an economic showdown, which would have just been calamitous for everybody, the trust is broken irrevocably. It is very clear now. Trump basically said it, that under his presidency, America would not fulfill its Article 5 obligations under the NATO Charter, would not come to the defense of a country that was attacked by Russia. Let's be clear, and so a lot of rethinking that's been going on, that needs to go on, is clearly going to go on now. This I think will be seen as the watershed moment when, at least under Trump, and that's the question remains is what can be salvaged after Trump. But for the time being, Europe and America are going to go their separate ways. And of course, the question is going to be, where does Canada fit into all that?
Well, that was the backdrop for this speech that Mark Carney gave in Davos, right? Trump's belligerence, is the threats toward Greenland, questioning NATO, and the reaction from European countries. So for Carney to sort of give that speech with all of that going on, I mean, it was certainly an interesting moment. The timing, I guess, maybe almost more so than the speech itself, is what seemed to make such a splash.
Yes, Carney captured the mood in the room. So that whether that was lucky accident or just he could sense where people were going, but this was a speech. It's there's no doubt it's been overpraised. This is not the second coming of William Shakespeare, but it was blunt, it was accurate, it was nervy, coming from the prime minister of the country most exposed to U.S. trade and therefore most at risk of retaliatory acts and manipulation. And I think people appreciated that. He wasn't preaching anything to them that he wasn't going to be facing himself. and ourselves. But the timing, the person speaking it, the bluntness of it, the accuracy of it, you put it all together. It gave people if people were feeling an inchoate sense of we have to do something, I'm not sure what, I'm not exactly sure why, et cetera. He kind of laid out for them, okay, this is why we're in this fix right now. And this is a very live debate in Canada, do we still, is the prize of integration with the U.S. economy still the prize? Now, I would have been one up until very recently who said, this is natural, this is logical, we are on the continent with them, we are huge beneficiaries from two-way trade with them. It is normal that we would be doing 75% of our exports with them. And with any previous U.S. presidency, and with any conceivable presidency before Trump, I would have said that was a risk worth taking. It is no longer a risk worth taking. It is clear. Carney was setting it in the context. It's not just America; it's also Russia and China have been using trade exposure, trade dependency with them as a weapon. We thought we were going to liberalize Russia and China through trade. It hasn't happened. They're using trade with us as a weapon. Carney was saying this can't go on any further. We need to be looking at alternatives, whether singly the country of Canada, we need to be looking at alternatives, but also the other countries of the world. And part of that search for alternatives is working together and forming new trade alliances and new, I don't think he said this, but new military alliances, I think, is part of the mix as well. We've got to be, I think you saw the seeds there, whether anybody pursues it, of a new force in world events, which is the middle power democracies, who had previously been grouped under the U.S. umbrella, cannot trust that umbrella anymore, are going to have to form their own alliance, and that is a new thing. People have dismissed this, saying, oh, people have talked about this before. Yeah, people talked about it before, and there wasn't enough of an imperative to pursue it because working with the U.S. was, for all of its sometimes frustrations, was worth doing it. We're in a completely new era with Trump. And as I mentioned before, the only question is it only under Trump or what happens after Trump? But those are questions we'll address later. But in the immediate term, we have to get out from under his attempts to blackmail us.
It is interesting. I mean, as you say, I think what you talk about requires more than just Canada taking steps. I mean, it requires others to go along with us. But I think that was one of the points, and we could talk about Pierre Poilievre too. I mean, one of the points he raised, I mean, it's a great speech, but what does this new Carney doctrine look like in practice? What's the follow through? What's the new policy agenda here that this all represents? Does it need to be more than just a speech?
Of course, the speech is the starting point, or even the midpoint. The speech is trying to bring people up to speed with where we are at and give it an overall shape and understanding. But then we've got to act. I think one of the key points in the speech for everybody, not just for Canada, but for people in America, for people who are opposed to Trump, for people in the other democracies, and has a particular poignancy for Canada, is we cannot allow the great powers, and this is not just about the United States, it's also about China and Russia, we cannot allow them to play us off against each other, to pick us off one by one. If we do that, we're sunk. And there's been far too much of that. It's how Trump got to power in the first place in the United States, is that people opposed him could not put their differences aside and work together to beat him. And it's certainly what's been happening on the international scene. So hang together, as Ben Franklin said, or hang separately is the choice in front of us. Now, I think there has to be some structure given to that. And that's why I think we need to be talking about some kind of formal trade / economic alliance / military alliance. People are talking about this. What's happening? Let me put it this way. What's happening in Europe is people are talking about we need to have a single European army. We need to approach this as Europe. And that's certainly better than waiting for the United States to do everything. But it leaves Canada in a particularly vulnerable position. So if the United States and Europe are cleaving from each other, Canada's got to figure out where it fits into that. And I think the answer is we've got to be close allies with Europe. We've got to be finding ways to be useful to them and supportive of them, and particularly in terms of manpower and materiel, such that they will be our allies in turn. So there's a huge rethink that has to go on that front. What Carney was talking about in trade terms was a number of smaller arrangements, sort of ad hoc, not trying to necessarily go for the big enchilada the way that we've done through the WTO, where you try to get everybody into the tent, but maybe be a little less ambitious in that sense, but get people who are of like mind in the tent. And there's a interesting question there is, what does like-minded mean? For the most part, I think it means democracies, liberal democracies. But there is this question of, do you trade with, and how much do you trade with countries that aren't that, and including the hegemons, including the great powers. And people will say, oh, this is inconsistent, this is hypocritical. We've just had this trade agreement with China. You can view it that way. I tend to prefer to look at it and say, look, if we were only dealing with China, if that was the only issue confronting us, then yeah, we could say, look, we don't need trade with China. We're not selling our principles, blah, blah, blah. When you are faced with dueling hegemons, when you're trying to get out from under the American thumb, I think you have to be a bit pragmatic at that point. It doesn't mean you rush into the arms of China, as some people are terming it. I don't think that's what has happened, and I'd be opposed to it if it was. But I think a measured outreach, a cautious opening, we'll have to see the fine print of what kinds of guardrails and are we avoiding becoming too dependent on China. But we definitely have to reduce our dependence on the United States. Some measure of increased trade with China, I think, is warranted, but you want to avoid becoming overly dependent on China, because there's no doubt they will use it against us as well. So that's the world we're in.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the Canadian government has come to the conclusion that, we can try to walk on eggshells if we want. We could still get clobbered out of nowhere by the Americans, right? And so even if what Carney has said and done has prompted or provoked a bit of a reaction, that I guess at this point, is it kind of, well, so what? It needs to be said, or it needs to be done. How is this dynamic changing?
I think this is what the lesson that people learned is: you can try to be nice to Trump, and it doesn't get you anything. It just earns his contempt. I've noticed that he shares this with Putin. Is the minute somebody bends the knee to them, they don't reward them for it; they humiliate them further. It's the mob boss psychology of, aha, now I've got you, and just to really prove I've got you, I'm gonna rub your nose in it some more. So that's the mentality that we are dealing with. So yeah, let's put it this way: people are very worried, and there's a debate forming right now. Should we be still making everything about trying to get closer relations or sustain the CUSMA, the Continental Free Trade Deal, at the expense of whatever else we're sacrificing at that? Or is that a prize that we really can pursue? Now, with any normal administration, of course. With Trump, he's going to make a series of insane demands. I guarantee you, in these upcoming trade talks, if the talks still go ahead, there'll be things that have nothing to do with trade, I would predict. They will be some of them will be things we probably should do, like get rid of supply management, but a lot of them will be things that are just extravagant and crazy and nothing to do with trade. Point one. Point two is whatever concessions he might make, if he makes any, in return for that, we have no reason to think he will actually follow through on. Literally, we cannot count on any of that. So what is the point of having that kind of trade negotiation? I think you really have to want it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Keep them talking, particularly keep them talking through the midterms. There's probably some value in it, but we should not be investing too much importance or significance to that, such that we can't walk away from the table if we need to, and we may need to. So I think we really need to look at it that way. But as I say, I see people, particularly on the conservative side of things, saying, well, that should be the prize, that should be the focus, and B, in my opinion, exaggerating what's been going on with China and talking about it as if we're falling into their arms or selling our souls, et cetera. I don't think anybody looking at what was negotiated there, I just don't see how you could call it that. By my calculation, the government backgrounder, it says it's an ambitious goal. We want to increase exports to China by 50% over 5 years. Let's supposing that actually happens, and ambitious goals usually aren't achieved, but let's supposing it does. By my calculations, China would go from being 4% of our exports to maybe 5%. This is, we're not rushing into the arms of anybody.
By the way, and the politics of all of this, because it almost feels like we're back into the climate, that cloud that was hanging over the election last year, that certainly I think worked to the Liberals' favor. That speech that Carney gave Thursday in Quebec City really almost sounded like a stump speech, and with the possibility of some really choppy waters ahead. I don't know. Is there the temptation for an early election? Is that on the radar at all? What do you read into that?
I certainly don't have any privileged information on that, but I would attach some probability to them doing that for a number of reasons. One is Poilievre, I think, is about to raise his game. I think you're seeing signs of that. I think, and I don't want to be too easy on him, but I think in the past months he's had this one eye on this leadership review, keeping the base on side. And I think that's given him license to some of his worst tendencies in terms of this kind of very choppy, populist, not particularly dignified approach to issues. But I think there are signs. I think he actually gave a reasonably statesmanlike response to Carney's speech that looked like an opposition leader that we might have had in the past. So if he raises his game, if he's got a bit more latitude, if the NDP comes out of their leadership race with a tenable leader and reasonably united, and such that they're a bit more of a force than they've been. I mean, Carney's had a very easy ride in a way over the last year because both the Conservatives and the NDP, for differing reasons, were kind of flat in their backs. But they're going to both, I think, be more of an opponent. Point one. Point two is there's a lot of stuff that's about to get really rocky for this country. Trump looks to me to be have us in his sights in one way or another. We've got the potential for two referendums on separation in this country, one in Alberta, one in Quebec, with the prospect that Trump might be either openly or behind the scenes aiding and encouraging at least one of them, which is a completely new thing. So it's new to have two provinces at the same time. It's new to have the President of the United States actively encouraging them. So that's going to be an enormous challenge to anybody who's in government in Canada. You've got the potential of the economy really falling off. So far it hasn't happened, but there's accumulating damage below the waterline in the United States that I think we'll have to see. But it does not look particularly sunny for them and therefore not for us. So adding all those things together, if you were a Liberal advisor, you might say better to go now. Go before your opponents get stronger. Go before the issues really start to crowd around you. Ask for a mandate to tackle these giant issues, particularly the threat to the country's A, territorial integrity, and B, sovereignty. It doesn't get any bigger than that. Carney still has an enormous personal advantage in the polls over Poilievre, 20 points or more. But interestingly, as of present, it's only about a 3-point margin between the parties. And the interesting question is, does the support for the parties eventually catch up with the leaders, or does it go the other way? And that would be one of the things an election would clarify.
The Alberta thing's interesting. The separatists in Alberta, I think, are more closely aligned with MAGA, with Trump. At the same time, U.S. statehood polls far worse than the idea of independence. Trump is very unpopular even here in Alberta. So aligning, that alignment would be an albatross, but the temptation is there, right, for that kind of meddling. And you've heard some fringe MAGA figures basically come out and say, we want Alberta. But even now to have the Treasury Secretary kind of creep into that territory, I think it's worth paying attention to, isn't it?
I absolutely. And I don't think that's the last we're going to hear from the Trump administration on this issue. I don't think it's necessarily coincidental that it came out after Davos. I think Trump was bruised by the experience. I think he's looking to blame somebody, and Carney is right there. Backlash of various kinds from the Trump administration, I think, is to be expected. So we'll see, but this may be the first shot of mounting campaign to try to mess with our internal affairs in the most significant way. I mean, this is like de Gaulle on the balcony in Montreal in 1967. Yeah. It's times 10. I mean, if it's sustained. I mean, de Gaulle was sent home, and that basically put an end to it. But this is something that the likes of which we've never had to contend with. It's basically like Russia meddling in the elections of the countries near it and trying to promote parties and candidates amenable to it. And we've just given ourselves this peculiar vulnerability because in this country, I think to our cost and our shame, we have validated the idea over the decades that secession is a legitimate option. I personally think it's as a practical matter an impossibility. That if you ever try to game out how it would actually be done, it leads to dead ends pretty fast. And the smarter Quebec secessionists have always known this. Varying degrees of smart, but Parizeau always knew you're never going to be able to negotiate this. If you get into the negotiations, it'll take 20 years. It'll go nowhere. His plan was basically do it all in a matter of a few days, basically a coup. And I don't think that would have succeeded either, but it would have made an absolute mess of things in Quebec. I don't think we're anywhere near that danger yet in Alberta. But I come back to my point is we should never have validated this idea that secession is a legitimate option. And I do think there's a case to be made. If we're in the middle of an attack on our sovereignty by the United States of America, maybe we can have a moratorium, let's put it that way, on secession referendums. Maybe we can come back to this in a year or two or three. But to be having to deal with, when we're having to fight off an attempt by the United States of America to God knows what to the country, I don't think we need second and third fronts. Now, the contrary position is Trump is the best friend Canadian unity ever had. that he's so unpopular. I mean, you saw in Quebec, where the support for the governing Liberals went up just as much as it did in other parts of the country, even amongst sovereignists. Your average Quebec nationalist can look at this and go, okay, I may have some issues with Canada, but I really don't want to be part of America. So it could cut either way on that.
Well, it is funny when you think how Donald Trump reacted to that, Ronald Reagan commercial that Ontario ran, but I mean, it puts Canada in an awkward position here. I mean, is it just about sort of planning behind the scenes to guard against foreign interference, or does it become something where we're out front, where we're pounding on tables, where we're denouncing these figures for what they're saying and do?
As always, that's you have to try and find the right no. But I think we're past looking the other way and coughing politely. I do think we're into a world where we're going to have to take a firm stand against that. I think the other issue is not, and I think you alluded to it, it's not just Trump or his acolytes getting up and making speeches on this. It's disinformation campaigns. It's covert funding or overt funding. I mean, but whatever we know about, there's probably a lot going on behind the scenes. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's not just America backing it, but also Russia. My general rule of thumb is you should never believe conspiracy theories unless they involve Russia, in which case you should believe practically all of them, because it always turns out to be, your worst fear about Russia turns out to be true. It's just like if you're trying to analyze Trump's motives and reasons for doing things, the dumbest, most perverse one is usually the most plausible one. People keep trying to ascribe to him some kind of genius level negotiating strategy, art of the deal, and it never turns out to be true. It's not plausible. It doesn't accord with anything else we know about him. Mostly he gets by on nerve and bluster and constantly surprising people because nobody can quite wrap their minds around how perverse he is. And we're about to see it with regard to Canada. I don't think people until now have really wrapped their minds around the idea that the President of the United States might well openly or covertly encourage the dismemberment of the Canadian Federation.
Well, on that note, we'll see where this all goes from here. Your latest on Davos and everything that's transpired over the last week, theglobeandmail.com. Andrew, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
My pleasure, Rob.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Andrew Coyne. You can find his latest on all of this at theglobeandmail.com. Be sure to check out his book as well from last year, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. You can also go back and find the interview we did with Andrew about the book, robbreakenridge.ca, or our YouTube channel, Rob Breakenridge Show. So plenty, I'm sure, to talk about next week. We'll see what happens with the resumption of Parliament, whether there's any more fallout in terms of our relationship with the United States. Who knows what might happen next? We've got the Conservative Convention happening in Calgary with, of course, the leadership review for Pierre Poilievre. So I think it will be another week of some significance in Canada. So we'll have plenty to talk about next week on the show. In the meantime, of course, as mentioned, robbreakenridge.ca, our YouTube channel, Rob Breakenridge Show. And of course, you can find us, download, listen to the podcast at your normal podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Thanks so much for joining us here this week on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.